Polish coast, 1950. The small group huddled amongst the rocks, only 15 feet from the breaking waves. The night air was cool, but thankfully not truly cold yet, as it would soon turn come winter. That would make the rowing easier. Andrzej carefully scanned the beach, but the coast seemed clear. The war may have ended 2 years ago, but the young Polish resistance fighter was still fighting against the Nazi occupiers. It was a hopeless battle. Hitler's armies had conquered the whole of Europe and were now pacifying the occupied Russian territories. There was no hope of freedom, but if not for himself, then maybe for others. He and his fellow resistance members had changed tracks from removing the Nazis to helping others escape them, namely Jews, Roma, and other minorities who were being rounded up by the millions and sent straight to their deaths in extermination camps across the continent. Andrzej gave a low whistle. A moment later, there was a return whistle. That was the signal all was clear from the team that was watching for German patrols. He nodded reassuringly to the 4 women and 5 children with him, as well as his 2 partners in arms. They only helped children and women escape the Nazis' grip. It was the men's duty to stay and fight. Following his cue, the group stood and began moving in a running crouch to the shoreline. They crossed the distance quickly and began to dig at the sand dune. The dune was actually 2 small boats that had been covered in burlap. To anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with the area, however, it just looked like another one of the beach's sand dunes. Andrzej tossed the burlap aside, revealing the boats, but something wasn't right. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, making it hard to see, so he used his hands instead. As he felt along the side of the boat, his hands moved across the strange shadows on the bottom of the boat. Bullet holes. Andrzej's cry of alarm was drowned out by the sharp sound of German whistles, the type their patrolmen and some policemen used to alert each other. A dozen flashlights came to life from the direction of where the resistance overwatch was supposed to be. It was a trap. He could just barely see through the glare of the lights a figure he recognized as Philip. Philip had been the one to give the all-clear signal, and now he had a gun to his head. The Germans only took prisoners so they could torture them, and the civilians he was escorting, well, they were dead either way. With the war, Andrzej unslung his submachine gun and began to fire at the rushing flashlights. He screamed at the women and children to get behind the boats, but then more flashlights lit up from behind them. It was a well-executed trap. Bullets roared back at Andrzej and his group in an angry fury, finding many members of his group. The muzzle flashes gave him something to aim at, though, and Andrzej turned his hatred on those unseen shooters, quickly expending one magazine, then another. He began to reload a third when he was shaken out of rage by David's voice. 15 years his senior, he fought in the short war to resist the Nazi and Soviet invasion before joining the resistance. Andrzej held him in the highest of esteem. "Andrzej, go! It's too late! Swim! Go!" David was vigorously gesturing at the lights of the ship out in the open water. Andrzej was stunned. Go? Leave them behind? What about the women and children? But the figures where they had been huddling between the 2 boats all lay still. "I can't, David. I can't just go." "Go, you fool. We're all dead on this beach. Go and live. Find another way to fight." Andrzej's legs were lead. He felt like a coward. David punched him hard in the arm, practically pushing him toward the surf. "Go, you idiot." Andrzej went. He rushed to the breaking waves as David unleashed a hail of gunfire to keep the German heads down. Before Andrzej dove beneath the waves, though, he heard the distinct sound of David's Błyskawica submachine gun go abruptly silent. He felt the impact of the bullets in the water around him, accompanied by a high-pitched shriek as they went from faster than the speed of sound to a standstill in just a few feet. Andrzej dove until he hit the bottom, and then he furiously pumped his arms and legs as he fought the surf, trying to push him back to the beach. In school, he'd been an excellent swimmer, and motivated by the gunfire of 24 furious Germans, he made it out to the surf line before surfacing for a desperate breath of air. As his head broke the water, he could hear the Germans still shooting, but they had no idea where he was amongst the tossing waves. Filling his lungs, he dove under and started kicking out to sea again. A few hundred feet offshore was an American destroyer accompanying a group of American merchant vessels. Ostensibly, the U.S. naval presence was to safeguard American shipping to Europe in waters it called potentially hazardous due to neutral shipping, despite the war being officially over for 2 years. In reality, it was a show of force by the U.S. After the fall of Britain, it was now the world's premier naval power, and it wanted Germany to remember that, should it get any ideas about crossing the Atlantic. Andrzej swam fast, and he could see the searchlights coming to life on the American destroyer. Crew scanned the water and the shore, both alerted to trouble by the German shooting. In little time, Andrzej was found and locked in the gaze of one of the big spotlights. The other 2 spotlights on the ship were aimed directly at the shore. The American sailors were blinding the Germans, so they couldn't shoot in Andrzej's direction. The United States had remained neutral during the war despite the pleas of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Agreements with the German Reich forbade it from loading political refugees from Reich territory onto its ships, but rescuing sailors in distress was part of international maritime law. Thus, U.S. ships routinely sailed near German-controlled coasts, meeting small boats full of refugees and helping them on board. The Reich launched protest after protest, but the U.S. considered these refugees to be sailors in distress and deferred German diplomats to international maritime treaties. A line with a flotation ring was thrown out at André, and he clung to it gratefully. He was nearly at the point of fatal exhaustion and couldn't pull himself up the rope to the deck. Instead, the sailors gestured and did their best in broken Polish to encourage him to slip the ring over his head and under his armpits. Working together, a team of sailors dragged André on board. He was immediately greeted with a warm blanket, and a few minutes later a hot cup of coffee. He was safe, on his way to America, but everyone else was dead. Manchester, English federally administered zone, pacified territories. Gerald impatiently waited his turn at the Reich's Cultural Affairs Office. In the last year, the Nazis had set to stabilize England and gotten on with the process of direct administration. It felt strange to him. Just a few years ago, this was the Kingdom of Great Britain, the most powerful empire in the world, with direct control over 25% of the world's economic activity. Now, it was just another piece of the Reich's territory, nominally independent, but in truth directly under the control of Berlin via proxy leaders. Perhaps most surprising is how most of the population simply went along with it. The Reichsmark had now almost fully replaced the pound as the German installed exchanges across the aisles. Sighing to himself, Gerald accepted that most people simply wanted to move on. Sure, there were still groups of rebels out there in the hills and forests, but the truth was Britain was beat through and through. The Americans refused to come to their aid this time, and even cut off their Lend-Lease program after the German protests. Britain had stood alone, cut off from its vital trade routes with overseas colonies by German U-boats, who choked the island nation off and starved it into submission. The RAF had fought bravely in the skies, but with no American oil supplies, the Luftwaffe eventually overwhelmed it. The entire countryside still bore the scars of German bombers and the subsequent fighting that raged after the invasion. Gerald's business had been one of the many destroyed in the fighting, and in exchange for government grants to get himself back on his feet, he was here at the Reich's Cultural Affairs Office along with dozens of his countrymen. It was illegal to operate or start a new business within the Reich without a license from a local administrator, and the process inevitably involved a trip to the Cultural Affairs Office. Soon, he heard, it would be mandatory for every citizen. But for now, the Reich's bureaucracy was overstretched with reconstruction. At last, it was his turn to enter one of the 5 interview offices. The man seated behind the desk was unmistakably German, not a British collaborator, but still greeted him with a polite smile. Gerald wished he was looking at that smile from down the iron sights of his Lee Enfield. "Welcome, Mr." The bureaucrat looked over Gerald's file briefly. "Gerald Adamson, I see you're here to complete your application for federal assistance." Gerald nodded. The bureaucrat's English was pretty good, with only the slightest hints of a German accent. He wondered if he'd been trained for his job back home or if he had been one of the thousands of spies and infiltrators who had sabotaged Britain from within during the war. "Excellent. We're eager to see your business restored and once more profitable." He didn't doubt the German was being honest here. The Reich liked efficiency and productivity. For all its evils, it was a very well-organized institution and pretty good about bringing order to the post-war chaos. "And I believe you brought your genealogy records, marriage license?" "My wife is dead, killed in the bombings." The German blanched for a second. Maybe he was human after all. "Ah, yeah, very unfortunate, Mr. Adamson. You have my condolences. I'm grateful that the unpleasantness is behind us now and we can turn to the task of rebuilding together." Rebuilding together, that was the Reich's favorite slogan, plastered all over the occupied territories it held. Every week, it seemed the Nazis' propaganda ministry churned out dozens of new posters, films, and slogans, but rebuilding together was a classic that never really went away. The bureaucrat had clearly been trained to use this phrase as often as possible. Yet, Gerald thought he detected a very real moment of sympathy when he'd offered his condolences. He took the man in for a moment. He was young, maybe young enough to have been in school during the fighting and recently graduated. After the brief silence, the bureaucrat continued. "Your current records will suffice, Mr. Adamson. A moment, please." The man went to work poring over the assembled paperwork Gerald had presented him. It was common business documents, tax records, insurance statements, but also documents personal to Gerald himself. Genealogy and family records, old wedding licenses, birth certificates. The Reich called it proof of culture, but everyone knew what it really meant. Just like everyone knew what happened to those individuals of unsuitable cultural background. Officially, the Germans were only deporting these people, but Gerald had been privy to intelligence reports during the war. He was pretty sure they hadn't shut down their extermination camps. Unofficially, he was pretty sure those camps were busier than ever. He ought to have been nervous. Who knew what the German Reich would consider unacceptable to their fanatical desire for pure bloodlines? But truthfully, he felt very little anymore. He'd faced death too many times on the battlefield only to end up surrendering to an enemy who was evil incarnate. The same enemy represented by this boyish bureaucrat in a smart suit, whom had shown real regret at the news of his wife's death. The more Gerald thought about it, the more he was sure the kid really was young enough to have spent the war in school. Shame, he thought to himself. It wasn't his fault, not really. But how many innocent British kids have been caught up in the crossfire of a war they hadn't started? Mr. Adamson, all looks in order, and I believe we can approve. But the kid never got a chance to finish his sentence as Gerald whipped his service revolver up and right into his face. One trigger pull later, and Gerald's application for federal aid was over. Gerald sat down heavily on his chair as the officers around him erupted with panicked screaming. He looked at the big clock on the wall in front of him, wondering if the Germans' reputation for precision and timeliness had taken hold even here, in the occupied ruins of Manchester. Exactly 3 seconds later, as the clock ticked 2:35 precisely, the dynamite bundle in his attaché case exploded. Voltkinsk, Southern Ural Special Administrative Zone. Absolutely not. There's no manpower. Karsten Stengel, administrator of the Southern Ural Special Administrative Zone, slammed his fist on the table to punctuate his point. The sudden gesture surprised the normally unflappable Schutzstaffel commander. Quickly recovering his composure, Standartenführer Grossman narrowed his eyes at the man who is technically his civilian superior. Need I remind you that orders to expend all efforts possible in the advancement of the Führer's cultural advancement programs come from the Führer directly? This question was more of a statement, or better yet, a sharpened dagger held at Stengel's throat. But while the good colonel might have gotten his way back in Berlin with such threats and bravado, it wasn't worth a damn out here in the Reich's frontier. Facts were facts, and the fact of the current matter is that there was simply not enough manpower. My dear Standartenführer, you're more than welcome to lend your men to assist in the pacification efforts. I'm sure the Wehrmacht would appreciate the help of such elite soldiers. The SS colonel's face went red with barely restrained rage. For a moment, Stengel thought he might unholster the pistol at his side. For his part, Stengel struggled mightily to hide the tiny smile that stubbornly crept into the corner of his mouth. Everyone in the Wehrmacht considered the SS mostly a joke. Pretty boys with fancy uniforms. It had been the army that had broken the French and English, and it had been the army who, after crossing the Channel and subduing England, turned on the Soviet Union. While the fighting was at its fiercest, the SS had busied itself murdering POWs and civilians who couldn't put up a fight. The entire organization disgusted Stengel, and so did its cultural advancement programs. Many in the army felt the same way. If Stengel gave the orders for Wehrmacht soldiers to assist the SS in rounding up communists, Jews, and God knows who else they had a problem with, he was pretty certain things wouldn't go the way the Standartenführer Grossman hoped. The southern Urals were far from the stable occupied territories of Europe and rife with partisans. The loss of an entire SS detachment wouldn't be entirely unlikely. The Standartenführer stood stiff as a board. Very well, Administrator Stengel. I will inform Berlin of the delays and your choice to not alleviate those delays. Stengel waved the SS man away and out of his office. Even if he could spare the manpower, which, with partisan activity rife throughout the Urals, he couldn't, he still wouldn't have done so. He knew where the SS prisoners went, and he wanted no part of it. Besides, other than putting him directly in one of the SS's camps, there was little more Berlin could do to punish him than make him an administrator of freezing territory in the former Soviet Union that practically swarmed with partisans. Damn communists didn't know they'd been beat. If only they'd reached Moscow sooner during the war, lamented Stengel. They might have captured Stalin. Instead, that bastard fled to the other side of the Urals, and the Reich, well, gave up wasn't the right term. Decided it wasn't economical to pursue into the worthless eastern stretches of Russia was more accurate. The Reich had all the important economic and industrial centers as well as the rich oil fields of southern Russia. Anything east of the Urals was frankly not worth the money or manpower to take from the surviving Soviet Union. With a sigh, Stengel turned back to reading the latest casualty and material loss reports from the never-ending peacekeeping operations against the communist partisans. The issue of the SS camps nagged at his conscience, though. They'd grown in number out here in the east over the last few years, and even more were being built to process the vast population of the occupied Russian territories. He grabbed another stack of reports, this time from his urban development supervisor. Chief amongst many of his concerns was the issue of unpopulated homes, which grew by the day. Entire population centers were becoming ghost towns. Wild animals were spreading into cities and bringing disease with them, an issue for the future German colonists, not to mention they'd be moving into cities falling apart around them from a lack of basic maintenance, a serious potential safety hazard and health hazard. His supervisor's recommendation was that vacated quarters simply be demolished. Future colonists would have to build from scratch. Berlin would be very unhappy about that. Northwest Saudi Arabia neutral zone, 32,000 feet. The roar of the B-36's engines was deafening, requiring the use of headsets for the crew to communicate. Captain Jonathan Frakes had to push up against his ear to hear his bombardier clearly. He'd already swapped his headset for a backup, but the issue persisted. Must be an issue with the actual connector then. He caught his co-pilot eyeing the horizon warily. and he couldn't blame him. They both served in the Pacific together during the war against Japan and gotten into a habit of keeping a sharp eye out for enemy fighters. Despite receiving an absolute wallop from the US Navy, the Japanese still managed to put up a pretty stiff resistance on the home islands. Rather than invade, America had opted to bomb and starve the Japanese into submission by destroying their industrial centers and blockading all Japanese shipping. After 4 years, the Japanese were starving to death and had little to no industry to speak of, prompting them to the negotiation table. Their forces in Manchuria suffered a little better. The Chinese nationalists had easily won over the communists after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and United Nationalist China backed up the might of the US Army and had pummeled Japanese forces cut off from resupply. Perhaps if the US had split its forces between the Pacific and Europe, Japan might have stood a chance. But with a united American military in the Pacific, even Japan's Pearl Harbor surprise did little more than slow the US retaliation by a few months. The big intercontinental bomber had been in flight for 16 hours already, taking off from the US base in China, skirting the Indian border on its flight west, since India was now administered by the German Reich. It had no escort because no fighter aircraft had the range for it, and if push came to shove, the B-36 could climb to a maximum ceiling of 40,000 feet and avoid any German fighter currently operational. Its mission was top secret, and there was a long list of contingency plans to put into effect should the bomber crash and the crew and payload miraculously survive. In fact, the Air Force probably preferred that nothing salvageable survive a crash. His bombardier alerted him. There was now only a few minutes from their drop point. Somewhere out ahead and below him in the desert were German positions, 23,000 German troops threatening to cross into the neutral zone, set up by an agreement between Germany and the US after the end of the war in Europe. Germany had driven a spear deep into former British holdings in the Middle East and then pushed deeper. Hitler's ambitions threatened to place the entirety of the world's greatest stockpile of oil in German hands, and the US had threatened war should it continue south and east. The truce had held, but now German troops were gathering at the edge of the neutral zone. Hitler was either testing the Americans or didn't believe they were serious about intervention. This B-36 was here to prove otherwise. Captain Frox began to climb altitude. No doubt the Germans had been warned. The US wanted them to have cameras ready and waiting for the show to come. America wanted there to be no doubt amongst any of the Reich's leadership that a continued war in the Middle East would end in disaster for them. With US troops so far from the region, it was difficult to present a credible deterrent, but that's what Captain Frox's mission was all about. The bomb bay doors opened with a shudder, causing the whole plane to shake as its aerodynamic qualities were compromised. In his headset, he heard the bombardier calling for him to hold course. Hold, 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 deploy, egress. There was the audible thunk of a payload being disengaged from the aircraft, and Frox didn't need his bombardier to tell him to begin egress. He had seen film footage of what came next, and already had the plane in a steep banking turn. He'd been assured there was plenty of time to egress, but he wasn't taking any chances. The plane was already several miles from the drop point when it happened. A bright flash of light, bright enough to compete with the sun, and moments later a supersonic shockwave that rattled and shook the aircraft, but the B-36 powered through it unharmed. The eggheads had been right. Frox had banked steeply to the left to put distance between himself and the bomb, but flew roughly parallel so the explosion could be filmed by 3 of the gunners. With the bright flash dissipating, he ripped off the special eye protection they'd all been assigned and took in the scene with the naked eye. The explosion was as awe-inspiring as it was terrifying. He'd heard that the US had these back toward the end of the war with the Japanese, but never used them. Now he could see why. Besides, with their island completely blockaded, the Japanese were no threat to anyone. Nobody deserved these bombs raining down on their heads, but that's just what the US was threatening to do if Hitler didn't respect Middle East neutrality. Surely the Germans weren't too far behind in developing their own, though. Watching the mushroom cloud growing over the uninhabited desert just 30 miles in front of the German positions, Frox wondered if he'd fired the opening shot of a brand new war. Want to learn more about what would have happened if Hitler won World War II? Check out what actually happened to Nazi leaders after World War II, or watch Most Evil Monarchs in the History of Mankind instead.